Welcome back. According to tonight's Washington Post, President Trump believes he's coming off as strong and decisive with how he has handled outspoken critic John Brennan. Yesterday, he explained to the Wall Street Journal why Brennan's security clearance was pulled. He said, quote, "I call it the rigged witch hunt, and these people led it." He added, "So I think it's something that had to be done." That was not among the reasons given by his press secretary yesterday.
Any benefits that senior officials might glean from consultations with Mr. Brennan are now outweighed by the risks posed by his erratic conduct and behavior.
And you probably know where we're going here. This would not be the first time the president, by blurting out the truth about an action he took, has blown up the cover story that was laid down and meant to explain the action in the first place. Remember the Comey firing? We were told it was because of his mistreatment of candidate Hillary Clinton. The president blew that up in the Lester Holt interview and admitted it was about Russia. The Trump Tower meeting was about Russian adoptions until it wasn't, until Trump finally said last week it was to, quote, "get information on an opponent." Well, joining our conversation, Elie Honig is back with us, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, former assistant attorney general for the great state of New Jersey, and remaining with us are Nancy Cook and Aaron Blake. Aaron, last night in real time, I said the president pulled a Lester Holt. Wake up to your headline. Trump blurts out another Lester Holt moment. Great minds think alike. This can make the job tougher for people like press secretaries, can it not?
Yeah, it certainly can, because this has happened over and over again. It wasn't just the Trump Tower meeting. It wasn't just the Comey firing. This has been a situation in which the people who represent the president either aren't allowed to talk to him or aren't getting the straight story from him before they're put out there to offer the first version of a defense. I think that this is actually a situation in which the explanation is somewhat more damning than the Lester Holt interview, albeit on a perhaps less problematic subject. When we're talking about the Holt interview, and I actually differ from some people on this a little bit, he didn't directly say that he fired James Comey because of the Russia investigation. He said the Russia investigation was on his mind when he did it, which I think is a different legal standard. In this case, he's actually talking about how John Brennan was somebody who led the, quote, rigged witch hunt, and something had to be done about it. That's a more direct line from A to B. And so I think if you're talking about an investigation in which they need to show that there's corrupt intent, that he's actually trying to impact the course of how this has gone down, that's actually a more compelling set of evidence for the prosecutors to look at.
Now, Counselor, let's say you're still a Fed, and let's say you're part of the Mueller team in Washington. You're looking at this president who has these apparent moments of clarity that torpedo cover stories that were laid down. What do you glean from all this?
Yeah, so, Brian, this is exactly why it's so important that Mueller get a chance to sit with the president, be it in an interview or in a subpoena grand jury situation, and get a straight answer from him, because he and his team have taken both sides of every issue. And a lot of this obstruction investigation is going to come down to the issue of intent. What was the reason the president fired James Comey, revoked the security clearance here? And if you have him on record saying, I did it for reason A and I did it for reason B, and they're completely inconsistent, he's got to be pinned down. He's got to live with one of those positions somehow or another. And that's why I think this subpoena battle is going to become so important in the months ahead.
Nancy, this is another one of those cases. How many people knew he had granted an interview to the Wall Street Journal? Was there anyone there to prep him and keep his thoughts on the straight and narrow? And to you and your sources, how much worry is there that you are picking up in the Trump West Wing? Because we're not talking about the Trump agenda again tonight.
Yeah, I think that, this whole week has been dominated basically by Omarosa and then, the Brennan stuff. They're just sort of not able to put forward an agenda where they're talking about things they want to heading into the midterms, because there's the Russia stuff that keeps coming up, the Manafort trial. And you can see, I think that's the real tension in the West Wing right now. The president is very jacked up about the midterms and feels like he plays this very key role in helping to sway Republicans towards Republican candidates. Whether or not that's true actually remains to be seen, but that is how he is sort of portraying himself. And there's that tension with him wanting to do that versus all of these other things that really threaten to swamp his administration, including his own admissions about why he's actually doing things. And I think it also speaks to how little people in the White House sometimes know about what's actually happening. I think sometimes the president is much more truthful with people outside the White House, even on his Twitter feed, than he is with his own senior aides.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.